She tried to find me for breathing mountain air. She didn't know I owned the air, the land, and every inch beneath her mansion. The road twisted like a scar through the forest, leading me back to a place I hadn't seen since childhood. My grandfather's cabin stood silent beneath towering pines, weathered but proud. I killed the truck's engine and just listened. Wind, birds, the soft ripple of the creek, the kind of silence city people pay millions to fake on white noise machines. Then I noticed the new sign nailed to the tree at the turnoff. Welcome to Whispering Pines Valley, an HOA community. My gut turned. HOA? Here. This land used to be wild, my grandfather's sanctuary from rules and nonsense. Before I could unload a single box, a small electric golf cart appeared, humming like an insect. At its wheel sat a woman who could curdle milk with a glance, blonde hair wound tight, lips pursed into a permanent scowl. "Excuse me," she said. "This is a private community. Are you lost?" I grinned. "No, ma'am, coming home." She looked at the cabin, then at my truck. That shack doesn't meet valley standards, and commercial vehicles aren't allowed past the gate. I laughed softly. "This shack was built before your community existed." She handed me a thick packet. "Violation notice. You'll be fined if you don't bring it up to code." Her golf cart buzzed away, leaving dust and fury in its wake. I looked down at the notice. Unauthorized occupancy, subject to board review. I didn't know it then, but I had just met Corinne Whitmore, self-proclaimed queen of the valley. And I was about to dethrone her legally and completely. 3 days later, I decided to attend the HOA meeting. It wasn't out of curiosity, it was strategy. If I was going to live here, if I was going to defend what was mine, I needed to see the enemy up close. The evening air was cool as I drove down the gravel road into the valley. The once wild hills that my grandfather and I used to hike through were now dotted with cookie-cutter homes, manicured lawns, identical mailboxes, and motion lights that blinked like sentinels guarding conformity. At the center of it all stood the community hall. It used to be an old barn, weathered, red, and filled with the smell of hay and memories. I'd spent entire summers there, chasing fireflies and hiding from storms under its slanted roof. Now it was sterilized, stripped of its soul and painted beige. A glossy HOA sign hung above the door like a crown. Silver Valley Estates, where order meets excellence. I parked near the edge of the lot, my truck standing out like an outsider among a row of polished SUVs. Inside, rows of folding chairs lined the hall, facing a long rectangular table draped in a white cloth. Behind it sat Corinne Whitmore, self-appointed queen of the valley. Corinne was everything the HOA worshipped: composed, perfumed, and dangerously polite. She wore a cream suit that matched the walls, her hair pinned into a perfect twist that didn't dare move. Her clipboard was color-coded, her smile measured. She wasn't just in charge, she was adored. Around her sat 6 board members, faces eager, pens ready, nodding in rhythm with her every word. I found an empty seat in the back near the door. A few heads turned. I recognized some faces, old neighbors from years back, their expressions cautious, even guilty. They knew who I was. They also knew better than to acknowledge me. Corinne's voice carried like a sermon. "Let's begin. As always, thank you for maintaining the community standards that make Silver Valley Estates such a desirable place to live." Her words dripped with the kind of practiced authority only people who have never been told no can perfect. She shuffled her papers, tapping them twice before speaking again. Item 1. Approved landscaping vendors. It's come to our attention that several homeowners have been using unapproved services. Effective immediately, any resident found in violation will be fined $250 per occurrence. A few uneasy murmurs fluttered through the room. Corinne didn't flinch. Item 2. Pets. We've had complaints about large dogs disturbing peace and damaging community grass. From now on, Pets over 20 pounds are prohibited within the valley limits. A man in a blue polo raised his hand timidly. Karen, our family's golden retriever's about. Karen cut him off with a smile sharper than a blade. Exceptions will not be made, Mr. Lee. Rules are what keep this valley beautiful. Wouldn't you agree? He shrank back. Yes, ma'am. Her gaze swept the room like a searchlight. Item 3, noise curfew. After 8 p.m., all outdoor activities must cease. This includes parties, loud music, and construction. Violators will receive written notice, followed by fines. Her tone softened only when she added, "Remember, these measures aren't punishment. They're protection. We're not just a neighborhood, we're a family." The audience nodded as if hypnotized. Then her eyes locked onto me. "Oh," she said, her voice curving into a sly grin. "Look who joined us tonight, the occupant of the unregistered cabin." Laughter rippled through the crowd. I stood slowly, meeting her gaze. That unregistered cabin was my grandfather. He owned this land long before anyone here was even born. Her smile didn't waver. If anything, it grew colder. And yet, the community charter gives the HOA jurisdiction over all properties within the valley boundary. You'll find we take pride in order. Order, I said, stepping forward a few feet. You mean control. The murmurs turned into whispers. Someone shifted in their chair. A woman near the front whispered to her husband, who shook his head, eyes wide, "Don't get involved." Karen leaned forward slightly, her polished nails clicking against the clipboard. "Mr. Cole, I suggest you review our bylaws. You'll discover that unregistered properties are subject to compliance or removal. Cooperation is in your best interest." "Compliance," I repeated quietly. "That's a pretty word for submission." The room went still. Even the air conditioner's hum seemed to fade. Karen's lips curved again, but her eyes hardened like ice. "I understand this may be difficult for you. Change often is. But if you intend to live here, you'll find that valley life comes with certain expectations. Ignore them and you might find life here expensive." She emphasized the last word with a faint tilt of her head, a warning disguised as civility. I stared at her for a moment, then glanced around the room. Every face I saw looked away, some out of fear, others out of habit. No one challenged her. No one ever did. That's when I understood. This wasn't just an HOA. It was a monarchy in beige. I didn't say another word. I simply nodded once and turned toward the door. The silence followed me out like a shadow. As I stepped into the cool night, I could still hear Karen's voice echoing from inside, sharp, commanding, absolute. The gravel crunched under my boots as I crossed the parking lot. A few residents slipped past me, whispering apologies with their eyes but not their mouths. One old man, Mr. Cunningham, who'd known my grandfather, gave a hesitant nod. "She runs things tight," he murmured under his breath. "Best not to cross her." I smiled faintly, too late. His eyes widened slightly, then he turned away, hurrying toward his car. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the glowing windows of the hall. Inside, I could see Karen still speaking, hands gesturing, her audience nodding in synchrony like a choir. A queen and her subjects. When my grandfather still owned this valley, things were different. There were no meetings, no fines, no curfews. Neighbors helped each other, fences were optional, and nobody needed permission to plant a tree or fix a roof. Then he passed and the developers came. The land I didn't claim, the parts I thought were too far or too wild to matter, were sold, parceled, and handed to people who thought community meant sameness. But they'd made a mistake. A small one, buried in the fine print, one that Karen clearly didn't know existed yet. My grandfather hadn't sold everything. I reached the cabin a little after 9. The porch light flickered as I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The smell of pine and dust hit me, old, familiar, grounding. I poured myself a cup of coffee, sat by the table, and opened the drawer where I kept a stack of old documents. Maps, deeds, survey charts, property records dating back to the 1940s. The papers were yellowed, the ink fading, but the truth was clear. The valley wasn't one unified block of land. It was a patchwork, parcels purchased over time, some privately owned, some deeded separately. My grandfather had always said, "Keep your paperwork in order, boy. One day it'll speak louder than any lawyer." He was right. I found the document I was looking for, the original Silver Valley land deed. And there it was in faded type. Ownership of central acreage, including water access, mineral rights, and airspace, to remain private and independent of any subsequent subdivision developments. My heart slowed, then steadied. Karen wanted to play queen. Fine, but she'd built her throne on land she didn't actually control. Outside, the crickets sang. A cool breeze swept through the pines. I looked out toward the hill where the new home stood, bright, sterile boxes glowing against the darkness. If she wanted a war, I wouldn't fight it with shouting. I wouldn't fight it with threats. I'd fight it the same way my grandfather would have, with paperwork. And by the time I was done, the HOA queen would realize one thing: you can't rule over land that doesn't belong to you. That night I stayed up late, spreading documents across the table like puzzle pieces. Every line, every clause, every technicality mattered. I'd been in business long enough to know how power really worked. It wasn't loud, it wasn't emotional. It was written in ink. And Corinne Whitmore was about to learn that lesson the hard way. As the first light of dawn touched the ridge, I leaned back in my chair, a faint smile creeping across my face. The valley would remember who really owned it. And soon so would she. The next morning, I woke to a sound that shouldn't have existed in this valley, a hammer striking wood. 3 dull thuds echoed through the stillness, cutting through the soft hum of pines and the distant rush of the creek. By the time I opened my door, the air already smelled faintly of sawdust and arrogance. There it was, a bright orange tag nailed dead center on the cabin's front door. The words were printed in bold, bureaucratic confidence. Final warning, demolition review scheduled. Structure deemed non-compliant with HOA and county standards. Below that in smaller print, inspection and potential removal authorized within 10 business days. Someone had even initialed it KW. Corinne Whitmore. I stood there barefoot on the porch, morning light cutting across the valley as if mocking me. For a long time I didn't move. The wind whistled softly through the pines, lifting the edges of the orange paper. Then something in me, the patience, the measured restraint, snapped clean in two. They wanted to tear down my grandfather's home, the one he'd built with his own hands in the 1940s, the place where I learned to hammer nails, fish the river, patch a roof, and live off the land. Not a chance in hell. I ripped the notice off the door, folded it carefully, and slid it into my jacket pocket. My hands were steady, but my heartbeat was. Corinne had made her first real move. This wasn't about fines or meetings anymore. This was eviction, erasure. She wanted me gone, and she thought a piece of orange paper could do it. By 9:00 a.m., I was driving down the valley road toward town. The morning fog hugged the hills like smoke from a dying fire. Each turn of the gravel road carried me past reminders of what the valley used to be: the old oak by the ridge, the rusted mailbox that once marked the coal boundary line, the stone wall my grandfather and I built one summer to keep out nothing but nonsense. Now all of it sat under the watchful eyes of new homeowners, their manicured lawns replacing wildflower fields, their plastic fences slicing through what used to be open space. Silver Valley Estates, a place built on my grandfather's dirt and my family's sweat, now run by clipboard tyrants. But that was about to change. The county land records office sat on Main Street, next to the diner where my grandfather used to buy me root beer floats after long days fixing fences. The same bell still hung above the door, though its jingle was weaker, older, as if tired from decades of ringing for nothing important. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old paper, dust, and nostalgia. Ceiling fans creaked overhead. Fluorescent lights hummed. Rows of metal filing cabinets lined the walls like sentinels of forgotten truths. Behind the counter sat Bert Weller, the county clerk for as long as anyone could remember, a man with spectacles that looked older than most of the buildings in town. He peered up from his newspaper when I approached. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, squinting, "if it ain't a coal." "It's been a while, Bert," I said, setting the orange notice on the counter. "Looks like I'm back to clean up a mess." He adjusted his glasses and leaned closer. "Ah, them HOA folks givin' you trouble, huh?" "Something like that. They're claiming my cabin isn't registered. I need to see everything tied to my grandfather's land, Sam Cole. Ridgewood Tract." Bert raised a bushy eyebrow. "Old Sam, huh? He was one of the good ones. Never took nonsense from the county or anyone else." "Sounds about right." He sighed, pushed aside his coffee cup, and stood up slowly, joints cracking like old wood. "All right, let's see what we've got. Ridgewood Tract, that's back when the whole valley was just one big property, before all the developers came in and chopped it into bite-sized HOA nightmares." He shuffled off toward the back, disappearing behind a row of file cabinets. I listened as drawers opened, metal scraped, and papers rustled like whispers from another time. After a few minutes, Bert returned holding a faded brown envelope labeled in hand-scrawled ink. "Cole Holdings, Ridgewood Tract." Dust puffed into the air as he set it down. He pulled out a small bundle of documents, some typed, some handwritten, all yellowed with age. He looked at me, eyes narrowing. "You sure you want to dig this up?" I nodded, "Absolutely." "All right then," he said, handing me the bundle. "These go back near 100 years. Not many folks realize how this land changed hands." I sat at one of the old wooden tables under the humming lights and began to spread out the papers. Property surveys, tax receipts, deed transfers. The more I read, the more it became clear that my grandfather's dealings had been deliberate, strategic. He wasn't the type to make random choices. He planned. He wrote things down. He expected someone to come for his land one day. Among the papers was one thin, brittle page folded into thirds. The ink had bled slightly, but the cursive was unmistakable, my grandfather. The heading read, "Lease to Ridgewood Development Co." The next line made my heart skip. "Valid for 99 years from the date of signature." Below that, a signature, Samuel A. Cole. And the date, October 4th, 1925. I froze, then I did the math in my head. October 4th, 1925 to October 4th, 2024. It was October 6th, 2024. 2 days past expiration. I sat there staring at the line, feeling the decades collapse into a single moment. My grandfather hadn't sold the land, he'd leased it. Everything built on it, the homes, the hall, even Corinne's oversized mansion, all of it sat on land that legally reverted to me 2 days ago. "Bert," I said slowly, holding up the paper, "you see this?" He squinted, took his glasses off, rubbed the lens, and read it twice. Then he whistled low. "Well, I'll be damned again. It's a lease, not a sale." He nodded. "Sure is, and it's expired plain as daylight. That means technically the land reverts to the original owner." He leaned back, chuckling. "Guess that be you then." My mouth went dry. Every acre of it. Every inch covered by this tract, which, if memory serves, includes the entire valley basin, the HOA's playground. He grinned, toothpick shifting between his teeth. "Looks like Miss Whitmore's empire just ran out of ground to stand on." For a long while I just sat there, staring at the signature. The ink had faded, but the intent was alive. My grandfather's foresight, his quiet defiance, had survived nearly a century. He knew someday someone would try to take what was ours, and he'd made sure they couldn't. "Grandpa," I whispered under my breath, a faint smile tugging at my lips, "you clever old fox." Bert looked up from the counter. "What you gonna do with it, Cole?" I folded the document carefully, sliding it into a protective sleeve. "First, I'm gonna make a few certified copies." "Smart." "Then," I said, glancing at the orange tag still on the counter, "I'm going to pay the HOA a visit." Bert chuckled. "Wish I could see their faces. Corinne's been strutting around like she owns the place. She's about to find out she doesn't." Outside, the sunlight had burned away the fog. The town looked different, sharper, brighter. Or maybe I was just seeing it through my grandfather's eyes again. As I walked to my truck, I passed by the diner. Through the window, I caught sight of familiar faces, locals who'd known the valley before the HOAs and bylaws. People who remembered Sam Cole as more than a name on an old map. A few of them nodded at me, curious. Word would spread fast once I filed those documents. The drive back up the mountain felt different this time. The trees seemed taller, the air fresher, the land somehow awake again. Every turn reminded me this wasn't just property, it was legacy. At the ridge, I stopped the truck and stepped out. The view stretched for miles, rolling hills, rooftops glittering under the afternoon sun, the community hall's beige roof gleaming like a crown that didn't belong. All of it sat on my land. I took a deep breath, letting it sink in. The sound of the wind through the trees almost sounded like my grandfather laughing somewhere in the distance. That evening, I sat on the cabin porch, the deed laid out in front of me under the fading light. The orange warning notice lay beside it, crumpled, powerless now. For years, they'd built fences and rules and meeting halls, but all of it was rooted in something they never truly owned. Tomorrow, I'd send copies of the documents to the county, the HOA board, and every resident's mailbox. But tonight, I allowed myself one quiet toast. I poured a finger of whiskey into a chipped glass and raised it toward the darkening sky. "To you, Grandpa," I murmured, "looks like your lease just came due." The crickets sang louder, the stars blinked awake, and down in the valley, the porch lights of Silver Valley estates flickered one by one, blissfully unaware that the ground beneath them had already changed hands. That was the night I stopped being a resident and became the rightful owner. But before I could reclaim it, I had to play my cards right, one clause at a time. Corinne thought she could use paperwork to bury me. Now I had the paper that would bury her. The afternoon sun burned low over the valley as I made my way back home. The sky had that golden glow that makes everything look peaceful, a cruel illusion, because peace was the last thing waiting for me. When I reached the ridge overlooking Silver Valley Estates, I saw the glint of metal before I saw the uniforms. Two private security guards stood beside the freshly painted entrance gate, the kind that rose automatically for residents but stayed locked for anyone else. One had his arms folded, the other was speaking into a radio. A black SUV was parked beside them, its engine idling. For the first time, the valley didn't feel like home. It felt occupied. As my truck rolled to a stop, one of the guards stepped forward and held up a hand. "Morning, sir. I'm going to have to ask you to turn around." I lowered the window. "Turn around, why?" "HOA orders," he said flatly. "Access restricted pending compliance verification." I stared at him for a long moment. Compliance with what? He checked a clipboard. "Property Code 8A, unregistered structure and occupant. You're not on the community's approved resident list, so entry is currently suspended." His tone was polite enough, but it was the kind of politeness that comes from training, the rehearsed calm that hides ignorance. "You got a copy of that order?" I asked. He glanced at his partner, then shook his head. Verbal instruction from Mrs. Whitmore herself. I smiled. Of course it was. I stepped out of the truck and reached into the glove compartment, pulling out a manila folder. Inside it was the official county-certified deed packet Bert had helped me print and notarize that morning. I handed it to the guard. "You might want to read this before you keep blocking my way." He hesitated, flipping through the pages. The longer his eyes moved, the slower his breathing got. "You see," I continued, voice calm, "I don't need access to the property. I already own it. The question is, do you?" His brows furrowed. "Sir, I'm just following orders." "I get that," I interrupted softly, taking the papers back. "But you're standing on private property right now. Mine." The second guard shifted uneasily, lowering his radio. "Wait, what?" Before I could answer, the sound of tires crunching gravel made us all turn. A white Lexus SUV rolled up, sunlight flashing off its polished surface like a mirror. I didn't need to see the license plate to know who it was. Karen Whitmore always made an entrance. She stepped out slowly, wearing a crisp white blouse, gold earrings, and those oversized sunglasses that screamed authority. Even her perfume, something floral and expensive, seemed designed to make everyone else feel small. "Mr. Cole," she said coolly, her heels clicking as she approached. "I was informed you were trying to force your way past our gate. That's not acceptable." "Force?" I tilted my head. "You might want to check the definition of that word. I stopped when your men asked me to." Her lips curved slightly, that practiced social smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm afraid you're not allowed inside until the board clears your occupancy status. Until then, you're considered non-compliant." I took a step closer. The guards looked uneasy but didn't move. "Mrs. Whitmore," I said, reaching into my jacket, "you might want to take a look at something before you start making declarations." I unfolded a paper and held it out toward her. Her hand hesitated before taking it. "What is this?" she asked. "An updated record from the county land registrar. As of 48 hours ago, the lease agreement for Ridgewood Development Company, the one your entire HOA sits on, expired, meaning your association doesn't legally own a single square foot of this valley." She lowered her sunglasses, eyes flashing. "That's ridiculous." "Is it?" I said quietly. "Read the date at the bottom." She scanned the document. For a long moment, the only sound was the rustling of paper and the faint hum of cicadas. Her smile faltered. "This can't be real," she whispered. "Oh, it's real," I said. "Signed by my grandfather, Samuel Cole, on October 4th, 1925. 99 years exactly. And as of this week, it's over." Her tone sharpened. "You're saying what exactly?" "I'm saying you and your board built your little empire on leased land, and now that lease has ended. So technically, Mrs. Whitmore." I paused, letting the silence hang like a blade. "You're trespassing." Her jaw tightened. "The HOA owns this valley outright. We have deeds, records." "Which are all attached to the Ridgewood Development lease," I interrupted. "You can check with the county yourself. Every plat map, every residential parcel, every so-called common area ties back to one root document, the lease my grandfather signed. The HOA never owned the land. They just borrowed it." She blinked, her composure cracking for the first time. "That's impossible," she said again, but the conviction was gone. "Our lawyers will say whatever you pay them to," I finished. "But facts are facts. The lease expired. The county records now show Samuel Cole Estates as the rightful owner of all valley lands, including the road, the lake, and yes, this gate you're blocking." The two guards exchanged glances. "Mrs. Whitmore," one said cautiously, "should we?" "Stay where you are," she snapped. I folded the paper neatly, slid it back into my pocket, and walked toward my truck. "Here, the funny part," I said over my shoulder. "You're worried about me getting in, but technically you shouldn't even be here." Her voice rose, sharper now. "Don't you walk away from me, Mr. Cole." I turned, meeting her glare. "I'm not walking away, Corinne. I'm walking home." The gate creaked open as I stepped into my truck. The guards didn't stop me this time. As I drove through, Corinne stood frozen on the roadside, her sunglasses now pushed up into her hair, eyes burning holes through me. Her perfect facade, the Queen's mask, was cracking. But she wasn't done. Queens never are. When I reached the cabin, the orange tag was gone. In its place, someone had slipped a letter under the door. It was typed, printed on HOA letterhead and signed again by Corinne herself. "Dear Mr. Cole, the HOA board has been made aware of your recent claims regarding property ownership. Until such claims are reviewed and verified, we request you cease all construction, alterations, or occupancy of the structure known as the Cole Cabin. Failure to comply will result in legal action for violation of community covenants. Respectfully, Corinne L. Whitmore, President, Silver Valley HOA." The arrogance almost made me laugh. She still thought she could write her way out of this, that paperwork was her weapon. But she didn't realize I'd already turned her own weapon against her. That evening, I went for a walk through the valley. It was eerie, so much beauty built on ignorance. Manicured lawns, white fences, families grilling dinner. They had no idea their entire neighborhood rested on land that wasn't legally theirs anymore. As I passed the lake, I saw the new private access sign the HOA had installed last year. It looked absurd now. Every drop of water in that lake was mine by inheritance, even the dock where they held their summer parties. I thought about my grandfather again, about how he'd always told me the valley had a soul, and that the land never forgets its owner. That night, as the moon rose over the ridge, I could almost feel it, the shift. The quiet power returning, like a heartbeat deep underground. The next morning, I was woken by the sound of tires on gravel again, this time heavier. Trucks. I stepped onto the porch just as a convoy of HOA maintenance vehicles pulled up. Out stepped Corinne and 3 board members, flanked by her same 2 guards. She had a clipboard in one hand and determination in her eyes. "Mr. Cole," she called out, her tone sugar-coated but seething underneath, "we're here to conduct an emergency compliance inspection. HOA policy allows us to." "Corinne," I said calmly, "you're standing on private property. I'd suggest you and your friends get back in your cars before this becomes a trespassing report." One of the board members, a nervous man in a golf shirt, whispered to her, "Maybe we should wait until the county confirms." "Quiet, Daniel," she hissed. I pulled out my phone and tapped the screen. Actually, the county already confirmed it. I showed her the email, a scanned copy of the updated record from the registrar's office. The subject line read, "Property Ownership Verification, Cole Estates." Her jaw tensed as she read it. "You're bluffing," she said finally. I smiled faintly. "Try me." For a moment no one spoke. A cool wind rustled through the pines, carrying the smell of pine resin and dust. Then, without another word, Corinne turned, heels digging into the gravel as she stormed back toward her SUV. The others followed in awkward silence. When the vehicles finally rolled away, the valley was quiet again. But I knew better than to celebrate. This wasn't victory, not yet. Corinne wasn't the type to accept defeat. She'd go underground now, lawyers, phone calls, strategy. She'd dig into every loophole, every gray area, trying to find a way to claw back control. But she didn't understand something fundamental. This land wasn't a chessboard. It was a memory, one that ran through bloodlines, not bylaws. That night I stood at the gate under the starlight. The metal glinted faintly, the HOA crest still welded to its center. I traced a hand over the cold surface, thinking of all the meetings, the rules, the fines, all built on a foundation they never owned. Tomorrow, I'd start the legal process of repossession. Bert had already promised to help file the official reversion claim. Once that was approved, every homeowner in Silver Valley Estates would get a letter explaining the truth. Their HOA dues had been funding improvements on my property. I didn't want their money, I wanted their queen. Corinne Whitmore had used power like a weapon, punishing people for painting their fences wrong, fining them for parking crooked, bullying retirees for leaving garden gnomes out past aesthetic hours. But this time, power would speak through paper again, only this time my paper. As I turned back toward the cabin, I saw the faint flicker of a flashlight near the tree line. Someone was watching. I pretended not to notice. Let them watch. Let Corinne send her scouts. Because soon enough, they'd all know the truth. And when the county officially recorded the reversion, that gate she guarded so fiercely would be nothing but decoration. I closed the cabin door and set the old deed on the table again. The signature at the bottom glowed faintly under the lamplight. Samuel A. Cole, 1925. My grandfather's last gift, his last laugh. Corinne had declared war, but she'd done it on my battlefield. And this time, she wasn't the one holding the high ground. When I finally turned in that night, I dreamt of the valley free again, quiet, alive. But even in sleep, one thought stayed clear. Queens don't take kindly to dethronement. And Corinne Whitmore, she wasn't going to go quietly. The storm rolled in around midnight, bringing a curtain of rain that hissed against the old cabin's windows. The fire in the hearth had burned low, glowing like the last heartbeat of a dying ember. I couldn't sleep, not after the day I'd had. The confrontation at the gate still replayed in my mind, Corinne's shocked face, her attempt to keep control of a kingdom that wasn't hers. I poured myself a glass of whiskey and wandered the cabin. My grandfather's scent still lingered faintly, pine, tobacco, and something like machine oil. Every board creaked with memories. The place had stood for nearly a century, long before the HOA and their rules, before manicured lawns and surveillance cameras invaded the valley. I found myself staring at the corner near the old stone fireplace, a faint outline in the wood floor, subtle but there. I knelt, prying at the edges with my knife. A loose plank popped up, releasing a puff of dust that smelled like time itself. Beneath it lay a small, rusted tin box, bound with wire and sealed with a strip of leather. My hands trembled as I pulled it free. Inside I found stacks of envelopes, aged to a soft brown. Some were addressed to my grandfather, others written in his unmistakable looping handwriting. There were receipts, faded photographs of hunters by a lake, a few old coins, and then one envelope different from the rest. It was sealed with red wax, cracked from age. Across the front, in bold ink, were 6 words that sent a shiver through me. To the next Cole who finds this. I sat by the fire, heart pounding, and opened it carefully. The paper was brittle, the ink faded but legible. If they ever forget whose land this is, remind them. This valley was earned with sweat, not signatures. I cleared these woods by hand, dug the well myself, raised the beams with neighbors who didn't need contracts to keep their word. They'll come someday, people with briefcases and promises, rules and fences. They'll call it progress, but it's greed wearing a suit. Protect it from the ones who think paper means power. They'll build walls, but they can't fence out truth. When they come for what's yours, don't fight them with rage. Fight them with proof. The letter ended with his signature, Samuel J. Cole, written with the same steady hand that had built this place from nothing. I leaned back, the firelight flickering across my face. My grandfather had seen this coming. The HOA, the control, the arrogance. He knew one day someone would try to claim what didn't belong to them. And he had left me not just a warning, but a weapon, knowledge. As I sifted through the rest of the box, I found more old survey maps showing original boundaries, handwritten notes about the lease agreements, and a ledger marked Ridgewood lease income, 1925-1930. Payments from a development company that had later become Ridgewood Estates. It was all there, proof that the land had never been sold, proof that everything Karen and her board had built rested on borrowed ground. Outside, thunder rolled across the valley. I could almost imagine my grandfather's voice in that deep rumble, steady, unwavering. "Don't let them take what's ours, son." I spread the documents across the kitchen table, yellowed maps, stamped deeds, typed contracts like a general preparing for battle. My laptop glowed beside them as I began scanning each page, digitizing every scrap of evidence. The more I read, the clearer it became. The HOA was standing on a legal fault line, and it was about to crack wide open. I paused when I found another letter, this one unsigned, tucked between two property tax receipts from the 1940s. It was written in my grandfather's more personal tone, not as a legal document but as a confession. "They tried to buy me out once, men in suits from the city. They said the valley could be a community paradise. I told them paradise doesn't come with dues and board meetings. They didn't like that. I knew they'd come back someday. When they do, remember the power isn't in the land, it's in the papers that prove it's yours." A chill ran through me. My grandfather hadn't trusted them, and for good reason. The HOA was nothing more than the modern form of those same men in suits. They just wore friendlier smiles. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving a dense fog hanging over the valley. I hadn't slept a minute, but I didn't need to. I had purpose now and ammunition. Stacks of scan files sat neatly organized in folders labeled Cole Original Deed, 1925. Lease Agreement Ridgewood Dev, Co. Tax Payments, 1925-2024. Boundary Surveys verified by county. I uploaded backups to multiple drives, emailed copies to my lawyer in town, and printed duplicates for safekeeping. The more I dug, the deeper my grandfather's foresight amazed me. He had left behind not only a home but a fortress of history. At one point, I stepped outside to clear my head. The valley was eerily silent. The fog curled around the pine trees, making everything look ghostly. I could see the faint silhouettes of new houses through the mist, Karen's palace among them, probably still asleep, unaware of how quickly her empire was crumbling. I thought about what my grandfather said, "Don't fight with rage." That was the hardest part. Every fiber of me wanted to storm down there and shove the deed in her smug face, to watch the look when she realized her throne sat on my soil. But no, this wasn't a fight for noise. This was a fight for patience, precision, and timing. Inside again, I noticed something odd in the tin box, a small brass key taped to the underside of the lid. It had no label, no tag. I turned it over, curious. Maybe it fit one of the old drawers in the workshop, or perhaps something more important. My grandfather never left things without purpose. I slipped the key into my pocket. It might be nothing, or it might open something that mattered. By sunrise, the fog began to lift, revealing the valley below, neat rows of identical homes, white fences, artificial ponds. My land, all of it. Every inch once wild, once free, now tamed by regulation and concrete. And now the tide was about to turn. I sat down again at the table, looked over the last scanned document, the lease expiration, clear as day, and smiled faintly. Corinne had her board of petty tyrants, her rules about paint colors and mailbox sizes. She had her fines, her threats, her so-called power. But I had something stronger. I had truth on paper, signed in ink, sealed by time. As the morning light filtered through the cabin windows, I placed my grandfather's final letter back in the tin box and whispered, "Don't worry, Grandpa. They'll remember who this valley belongs to." Then I closed the lid, feeling something I hadn't felt in years, purpose, and the calm before a storm of my own making. Corinne thought she'd won the first few rounds, but she had no idea the battlefield was already shifting beneath her feet. The valley might look quiet from the outside, but under its soil, under its foundations, history was waking up again. And I was its messenger. The phone rang just after sunrise. I was still half asleep, head on the kitchen table, surrounded by documents and coffee rings. The storm had passed, but my mind hadn't stopped racing all night. The call jolted me upright. "Cole here." A raspy voice came through the line. "This is Bert from the county records office. You'd better come down here. I found something else you're gonna want to see." Something in his tone, part excitement, part disbelief, made me grab my jacket without hesitation. The county records office was an old sandstone building with warped wooden floors that smelled like dust and ink. When I stepped inside, Bert was waiting at the counter, a rolled-up document in one hand and a mug of coffee in the other. He waved me over like a man who just uncovered buried treasure. "Couldn't sleep last night," he said with a grin. "Kept thinking about your granddad's lease, so I went digging through the archives." He laid the rolled parchment on the counter and carefully unfurled it. The edges were torn, the paper yellowed to the color of bone, but the ink-dark, deliberate lines was still clear. It was a hand-drawn survey map labeled Coal Holdings, Ridgewood Tract, 1925. The map took my breath away. It wasn't just the size of the boundary lines. It was what those lines enclosed. The property stretched far beyond the HOA's neatly fenced community, miles of untouched forest, rolling hills, and even the winding curve of the Ridgewood River. The HOA development, as large and proud as it seemed, only occupied a fraction, maybe half of the original coal land. Bert tapped his finger on a shaded area near the northern edge. "See this?" I leaned closer. It was a marked section labeled Ridgewood Reservoir Site, Lease Section 3B. "That's the water source for the whole valley," Bert said. "According to this map, it's smack in the middle of your property line." My pulse quickened. "You're saying the HOA doesn't own the reservoir?" He smiled, eyes twinkling. "Didn't lease it either, not according to what I've found. They've been pulling water off coal land for decades without renewal." I stared at the map in silence for a moment, the realization sinking in like cold water through soil. Water rights in this valley weren't just property, they were power. Bert must have read my thoughts. "You know, your grandfather was a smart man," he said, lowering his voice. "He filed a separate claim for mineral and water rights, not just for the land but everything beneath and above it. That means groundwater, rivers, and whatever minerals are still down there. Nobody can use it without your permission." I rubbed a hand over my face, trying to contain the grin forming. "So, technically, every faucet in the HOA runs through my property." He chuckled. "Technically, son, that's not just technical, that's legal fact." I left the office with the map rolled under my arm, the morning sun blazing down on me like a spotlight. For the first time since returning to this valley, I didn't feel like the man being cornered. I felt like the one holding the reins. The drive back wound through pine-covered hills, the same road I'd taken hundreds of times as a kid. Only now every bend, every stream, every glint of water meant something new. It was mine, all of it. As I approached the valley gate, I slowed to a stop. A shiny new sign had been hammered into the ground overnight. "Private Community. Access BY authorized members only." I almost laughed. The irony was delicious. They were guarding land that didn't belong to them, standing on soil they technically leased from me. I parked, stepped out, and looked toward the glittering blue expanse of the reservoir in the distance. Beyond the manicured lawns and artificial lakes, that single body of water fed every sprinkler, every shower, every swimming pool within Karen's carefully controlled neighborhood. And it sat squarely inside coal property. My grandfather's words from the letter echoed in my head. "They'll build walls, but they can't fence out truth." They had built their kingdom on borrowed water, and the tide was about to turn. That evening, I cleared the table again and spread out the map beside the scanned deeds. The outline of my land stretched wider than I'd realized, a crescent embracing half the valley. The ridge to the north contained natural springs that fed directly into the Ridgewood Reservoir. My grandfather had marked it clearly with tiny inked arrows and notes like flow direction and main catchment zone. I found another smaller notation written in his hand. Access hatch installed 1930, valve controls main feed. I stared at that sentence for a long time. My grandfather, meticulous as always, had built a manual control valve for the water flow. A primitive system, probably, but still there. I traced the location on the map. It was near the old pump house at the northern ridge, deep in the woods, far from the HOA's reach. I'd played there as a kid, back when it was just a rusted shed beside a creek, forgotten and overgrown. If that valve still worked, it could control the water flow to the entire development. I folded the map carefully and slipped it into a protective sleeve. The air in the cabin felt charged, heavy with something electric. My grandfather had left me the land, but he'd also left me leverage. Quiet, invisible, unstoppable leverage. Before bed, I stood on the porch, looking down over the valley. Lights glimmered from the homes below, neat rows of golden squares in the dark. The sprinklers clicked on, mist rising like ghosts from manicured lawns. Corinne's house stood out even from here, the biggest one on the ridge, lit up like a palace. I imagined her there, sipping wine, checking her phone, maybe drafting another violation notice for me. I smiled to myself. She had no idea that every drop of water feeding her roses flowed from land she didn't own, from a spring she couldn't touch without my consent. Tomorrow I'd visit the pump house. I needed to see it for myself, the old valve, the structure, the pipeline routes. I wouldn't do anything drastic yet, not until I had proof and a plan. But still, the idea lingered in my mind like a whisper. What if I shut it off? Just for a day, just to remind them where the real power came from. I could already imagine the panic, the HOA emergency emails, the committee meetings, Corinne's perfectly manicured hands slamming her phone down as fountains stopped spraying and pools began to dry. I didn't want chaos. I wanted understanding, respect. They had mistaken ownership for authority. It was time to correct that mistake. The next morning I was up before sunrise, map in hand, hiking boots laced tight. The path to the northern ridge hadn't changed much. The forest had swallowed most of the trail, but the old landmarks were still there, the leaning oak, the split boulder, the half-buried fence post. When I reached the pump house, I stood still for a long moment, taking it in. The roof had half collapsed, vines snaking through the cracks, but the steel door, rusted and dented, was still locked. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small brass key I'd found in my grandfather's tin box. It fit perfectly. The lock clicked open with a sound that made my chest tighten. Inside, it smelled like oil and damp earth. Pipes ran along the floor, feeding into a massive rust-covered wheel valve connected to the ground. A single brass plate was bolted to the wall. Cold water access system, installed 1930. I knelt beside the valve, brushing dust off the markings. The lever was stiff but intact. It was the kind of engineering that survived generations. I turned it slightly, testing resistance, and felt the faint rumble of pressure in the pipes. It still worked. My heart pounded. The map, the deed, the valve, all threads of the same story. A century-old design, waiting for the moment it would be needed again. As I stepped back into the sunlight, I looked down at the shimmering roofs of the HOA below. Somewhere down there, Corinne was planning her next rule, her next threat, her next meeting. But I had something she didn't. I had the source. The heart of the valley, beating under my name. And if she wanted to keep her little kingdom alive, she'd have to start by recognizing whose water she was drinking. I walked back down the trail, the sound of the river echoing through the trees. My grandfather's voice lingered in my thoughts, calm and sure. They can't fence out truth. He'd been right all along. Karen might have controlled the HOA, but I controlled the valley. And soon, she was going to learn just how deep those roots ran. My attorney, Dana Brooks, nearly dropped her coffee when she saw the documents. Ethan, this isn't just a lease expiration. It's full reversion of property rights. You own everything inside that boundary, land, easements, utilities, everything. Even the HOA roads, I asked. She grinned, especially the roads. We filed the ownership confirmation with the county recorder. Within 48 hours, every HOA-controlled asset was under review. Karen called me, voice trembling with fake calm. "Mr. Cole, perhaps we can negotiate." "Negotiate," I said. "You fined me for chopping firewood, now you want to talk." I was only enforcing policy. And I'm just enforcing ownership. Silence, then the line went dead. The next board meeting was standing room only. Homeowners panicked, whispering about deeds and titles. Karen stood at the front, clutching a binder. "Do not listen to his lies, the HOA." I stepped forward and laid the documents on the table. "Has no legal standing. County confirmed it. As of this week, all property rights revert to the Cole estate. You've been trespassing for years." Gasps filled the room. One man shouted, "You mean we don't even own our homes?" "Your homes, yes," I said, "but the land beneath leased, and the lease expired." Karen's face drained of color. "You can't do this. We'll sue." I smiled. Already tried. The county sided with history. I turned to the crowd. "You can stay. I'll honor fair leases, but the HOA," I looked at Karen, "is finished." 2 weeks later, the HOA signs came down. The gates were removed. The valley breathed again. I let residents keep their homes under new agreements. No fines, no harassment, no ridiculous rules. Karen, stripped of her title, tried to cling on, sending desperate letters. But no one listened anymore. Her mansion went up for sale within the month. I spent my evenings on the porch just like Grandpa used to. The air was finally free again. No patrol carts, no paperwork, no plastic smiles. The land felt alive. And so did I. Autumn painted the valley gold. I sat on the porch with a mug of coffee as the sun dipped behind the ridge. The cabin was restored, the community calm. Kids played by the stream again. I thought of my grandfather's letter. "They'll build walls, but they can't fence out truth." Karen had tried to rule what was never hers. I didn't seek revenge, I sought justice. And in the end, justice looked like peace. The valley was mine again, not just on paper but in spirit. I raised my cup to the fatting sky and whispered, "Rest easy, Grandpa, the valley's home again."